Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Gravity, antigravity, antigravity, see also cosmology, see also dark matter. Contact Report 054.
I would have another question, however, concerning gravity. Is the electromagnetic nature one or two pole, or does it happen through the mediation of gravitons?
Gravity is electromagnetic in nature with two uniform but opposite forces. Gravity is therefore both attractive and repulsive. But this is connected with the mass itself, with the Earth, thus by the planet, whereby the mass exerts the coherent, however the second factor itself, namely the production and application of what you call gravitons.
The term graviton does not come from me. But it seems to me now that you explain that these gravitons and electromagnetism are present at the same time and would act as attraction and repulsion?
Sure, that is all I am allowed to tell you officially until I have consulted with the others.
It is all right. I do not want to rush you. But can you still tell me how gravity is created? I mean gravitons and electromagnetism? I mean only in broad terms, like for example by warmth and cold.
But good. On the one hand, the causes can also be found quite correctly in the heat and cold, in the self-heating of the planet, and in the cold of the space. On the other hand, the solid core of the planet in its density, as well as the atmosphere, etc., are also important factors in the formation of gravity and anti-gravity.
Contact Report 066.
The natural cosmic laws require a uniform and consistent development within the framework of all evolutionary concerns of all levels. This means that the spiritual as well as the material consciousness-based development constantly progress in harmony with each other and must always be in harmony with each other in accordance with the consistency of all things. In the case of the control of gravity, the rules of the laws are ordered in such manner that primarily the consciousness-based evolution is of decisive importance for the development of technological aids for the control of gravitational forces. Thus, as a rule, the application of the power of consciousness to paralyze the gravitational forces first leads to technological coping, and only at a much later point in time, with the corresponding development of the power of consciousness, does the possibility occur through which a human being can move weightlessly through space. You call this state produced by the power of consciousness a levitative moment, which means nothing else than that a levitation process takes place, in other words, a levitation. At the beginning point, this state is evoked in an unconscious form to the human being, and only gradually does he or she learn to master it consciously and to purposefully steer it. If the human being has learned to master these powers, only then will he or she be able to devise and construct highly technological aids. Thus, the control of gravity at its primary and primary point is based first and foremost on the evolution of consciousness, which means that physically, the above-mentioned powers can only be mastered when the human life form has freed itself from the heaviness of unknowledge and non-consciousness-based matters. According to your linguistic usage, however, I must now explain. Exceptions confirm the rule, even if this exception is not easily recognizable and proceeds in a form that does not appear very frequently. Such an exception is the Earth human. He or she is not yet capable of mastering consciousness with all its consequences, and yet they are already capable of finding their way in the field of gravitational force research to a great extent. This exception rests in the confusing fact of a very rare erroneous development, which has fundamentally shifted the potential of the rectification of consciousness and the material realm overall, whereby the material realm has become overpowering and dominates in relation to the evolution. This explains why the material realm has come to the fore and has become dominant in terrestrial human beings, whereby evolution takes place primarily in this direction, while the purely consciousness-based evolution lags behind at a disadvantage, as you yourself once said. This is why technology on Earth is far more developed than the evolution of the consciousness. It should be noted, however, that especially since 1937, the strong influences of the New Age have led this mismatch of the material realm throughout the world into much lighter and more moderate paths, whereby the difference between the prosperity of consciousness and pure materialness is no longer as great as is generally assumed.
Contact Report 225.
Then still another question about gravity. Like each and everything that exists, gravitational power surely also has a speed. In addition, at least, so I have understood Ta's explanation relating to this, gravitational power is incorporated into the same speed limit as light. Gravitational power is not just given with suns and galaxies, planets or meteors, asteroids, comets, as well as with universal nebulous formations and neutrino clouds, but rather, it also exists in universal space itself. At least, that's how I understood Ta's explanations. And since I have now been asked about this by Professor Brenner and I want to give him the answer correctly, I would again like to ask if what I have said is right.
As usual, everything is of correctness.
Contact Report 228.
Moreover, our universe, like any other, of course, consists not only of gross matter, but also of pure energies, one of which is black energy, as we call it, which is responsible for a certain form of anti-gravity in the material universe and is estimated to account for 3/5 of all universal energies.
Contact Report 260.
But now, I have here another question. Anti-gravity, Sim Ya-se, once told me that both heat and cold are connected with it.
That is quite right, but not to be regarded as general. Heat and cold play a role only in the way that through these, electric energy, that is to say, electromagnetic energy, is produced, from which then, among other things, anti-gravity arises through certain processes.
Can or may you explain that in more detail?
No, for the time still isn't ripe for that. It would be too dangerous for the people and their applications of technology if they already fully mastered anti-gravity. Already the researches relating to this of the Earth humans and their resulting applications of anti-gravity are heading towards them seizing world power for themselves. There are already extensive experiments in this regard, whereby the scientists in the USA can report authoritative successes.
Contact Report 586.
Here is my question. On the one hand, you say that dark matter is an expanding substance or matter. But on the other hand, you also once said that only through dark matter is gravity possible and can function. Isn't that a contradiction? Somehow I just do not understand the whole thing. It confuses me.
As far as I am allowed to make a statement, I will explain the following. Dark matter is an interactive mass, which means that it is massive particles which, measured in the atomic range, have an enormous weight. These massive particles have an interaction that is related to both gravity and expansion force, which is why I explained that dark matter is expansion matter, although I did not mention that it is also gravity matter. So without the dark matter, there would be neither centrifugal force nor gravity. So without gravity, no expansion substance can exist, and without expansion matter, no gravity. Both factors, centrifugal force and gravity, are everywhere, but they are only perceptible and therefore also measurable but not visible, because they radiate neither light nor darkness visible to the eye. I am not allowed to explain more about this.
Contact Report 592.
Thanks. Then once again I have a question about dark matter, which you call expansion matter. I was asked a question about what is meant by this. So I answered what you explained to me, that expansion substance is the universal gravitational force, which runs through the whole universe like a net and forms knots and groups, in constant change. And if I myself have understood correctly what you have explained to me, then the entire network corresponds to an invisible gravitational energy, which attracts or forms and collects every form of fine matter, and at the same time expands or expands, from which material formations and even galaxies are formed, whereby in this respect the very energetic nodes play a particularly important role. So this invisible universal gravity net, especially its nodes, forms all kinds of fine matter, whereby this fine matter is not yet known to earthly scientists. The nodes are constantly widening and expanding, which ultimately results in visible matter that develops into galaxies. And because the dark matter expands in this way, you call it expansion substance, whereby the invisible matter develops and expands into nodes or visible matter, from which planets, suns, and whole galaxies develop over billions of years. Dark matter is not to be confused with the factor called dark energy, which corresponds to the universal centrifugal force.
Contact Report 605.
First, I want to say that I'm glad that you are still in the area, and that you could still come here this night. And secondly, our correction work on Guido's book has shown that I cannot cope with certain formulations, namely the terms mass and weight, as well as weightlessness and zero gravity. My logic tells me that a mass can probably change in terms of its consistency, density, and volume, both on Earth and in world space. Thus it can condense or expand through whatever circumstances, but it remains in its entirety as a mass and thus becomes more or less only in the way that it expands or contracts. As a result, the mass as such always remains the same and only changes physically or in volume. But every mass now also has a weight, and this is in and of itself unchangeable, and that regardless of whether on Earth or in space, and thus also in so-called weightlessness. But now it is asserted by earthly scientists that through the increase of weightlessness, and through the fact that gravity no longer exists, a weightlessness arises, just as in the space of the world, where there is no perceptible force of gravity, and therefore no one can be measured. I find this assertion illogical and contradict my reason, because no matter whether gravity or gravitation is given or not, the given weight remains the same. Thus, according to earthly measure, 100 kilograms are exactly the same weight on Earth as on the Moon. On an asteroid or comet, consequently the weight does not become lighter, but remains in its weight measure. What changes is only the gravitational attraction ratio, which is followed by the fact that the 100 kilograms appear to be lighter on the Moon than on Earth due to the lower gravitational attraction, although they remain constant at 100 kilograms. This apparent lightness of weight in the world dream, in free fall or on the Moon, is explained by earthly scientists as weightlessness or weight reduction, which, however, contradicts my understanding of logic, because by a reduced or cancelled attraction, a weight cannot be reduced, but it remains the same, if nothing of it is taken away. So I think that scientists start from false assumptions, and do not stick to reality, and try to explain something they don't understand. It is also possible, however, that they simply have no idea what it is really about, when a reduction in attraction seems to reduce a weight. Our dear Ueli has, apparently, led into the field. Also, I do not know of any such term that could be used for the apparent lightening of the weight, and explain the matter.
I am familiar with this problem of the lack of concepts in relation to what you are referring to, although we do have a corresponding name for it if a weight is apparently reduced or even eliminated by a reduction or complete suspension of the gravitational force. We call this state, when I translate our term into the German language, anti-gravitation status, which in the sense of your question expresses that it is a matter of an annulment of the gravitational pull of the body in question, or of a material in which the outer gravitation becomes ineffective. Every matter on Earth, for example, a human body, has its own weight and thus also its own gravity, although this is extremely small in relation to Earth's gravity and cannot be consciously felt by Earth's inhabitants. The fact is, however, that only this dead weight together with the dead gravitation makes it possible for the body to be attracted by Earth's gravitation. This means that only if something has an own weight, and thus only a minimal own gravitation in the nanoscale, can it be attracted by an external gravitational force. However, if something is given that has neither a dead weight nor a dead gravitation, then it cannot be attracted by an external gravitation. It must therefore be understood that every matter, however small it may be, has its own gravity and thus attracts other material, even the tiniest bacteria. Also, Earth naturally has its own large force of attraction, which is also called gravitation, gravity, or even force of attraction. This gravitation causes bodies to attract each other, with the corresponding force depending on their mass and the distance between them. The closer they are to each other, the more they attract each other. If one body is much heavier than the other, it also pulls much harder on the one that has a lower weight. On Earth, this can of course only be determined by extremely sensitive measuring instruments, but in comparison also by the use of magnets. If, however, the outer gravitational force is weakened or even eliminated, as in the case of the outer planetary layers, up to nearby space, then any outer matter loses its own attraction according to its own weight, which results in an anti-gravitational status for it, which is erroneously called weightlessness by earthly scientists. But this does not correspond to the correctness, because every matter, thus also the human body, does not become weightless, but only an anti-gravity status takes place, which means that it escapes from the planetary gravity. The body thus escapes the external gravitational force and influence of Earth. And the further the body moves away from Earth gravity, the smaller it becomes and gives it the possibility that it attracts some material by its own gravitational pull, even if these may only be very small quantities. If, for example, the International Space Station ISS is taken as a comparison in this respect, then it is still in a gravitational orbit of Earth, but due to its size it already has a low inherent gravity through which it can draw materials from space. So there is no weightlessness, as it refers to your question, because it is a weight deception that appears as fact and reality, but in reality is not really given and contradicts the effective fact because it is only apparently existing, given and present. In any case, a weight always remains of the same weight, regardless of whether there is a light or large gravitational force. This only determines whether a weight is more or less attractive than a stronger or weaker gravitational force.
But another thing, when we talk about weight, it only refers to the units of weight that we use here on Earth, such as the units milligram, microgram, gram, nanogram, pound, kilogram, hundredweight, and ton in the large part of the European area, whereby the whole thing also depends on the gravitational force. So inevitably on other worlds as well as on our moon, on asteroids and comets, completely different amounts of the same materials are necessary, depending on the gravitational strength, in order to obtain the same weight as with us on Earth. So materials can be much lighter, and thus planet, etc. can show less gravitational force. Or materials can be much heavier, because planet, etc. shows much greater gravitational force, as a result of denser, that is to say, more compact matter, resulting in much greater gravitational force. The gravitational force is also dependent on the speed of rotation of Earth as well as the temperature, respectively cold and heat, in such a way that these have an influence on the density and consistency of the matter, As your father Svath already explained to me in my youth, as well as your daughter Simya-se, after our contacts began in 1975.
Contact Report 643.
What I've wanted to ask you for a long time refers to what your father Svath explained to me, that earthquakes and volcanic eruptions influence the gravitational waves of Earth, or change them in a certain way, whereby the gravitational vibrations can be measured and registered. Such and other gravitational oscillations, Svath explained, would arise on the one hand on all active planets, but also when planets or 2 or even 3 black holes, but also suns or galaxies collide. He also explained that such events produce very strong gravitational oscillations, which propagate at very high speed throughout the universe. However, as I have searched in vain for relevant explanations in specialist journals and books so far, I want to...
Up to this day, you cannot find any descriptions concerning this phenomenon in earthly scientific publications, because as far as I know, there are no findings and experiences corresponding to the matter, no findings or experimentally successful attempts of specific efforts concerning findings and recordings of gravitational oscillations.
Then must I understand by what you say that Earthlings cannot yet measure and record Earth gravity vibrations, nor the other gravity vibrations as I have called them according to your father Svath's explanations?
That is the point of my words.
Contact Report 645 Svath, 1947. So time only exists where there are gravitational forces. Where, however, no gravity exists, there is also no time, but only endless duration and thus timelessness. Contact Report 790.
This is what I learned to say from Svath, and what I learned from him is all just a little different from what earthly science claims. As far as I know, the Earthlings still have no idea that everything is also dependent on swinging waves, namely on the swinging waves of the Earth itself, that it is precisely the Earth's gravitational swinging wave that makes it possible for something to grow and flourish. However, it is not only the gravitational swinging waves that play a very decisive role, which emanates from the Earth, but also other aspects that are just as unknown to earthly scientists as the gravitational swinging waves, which, as far as I know, they do not yet know.